The night swayed with a cruel wind that scraped across the empty street, and she pressed herself tighter beneath the weak glow of a flickering street lamp, trying to hold on to warmth that simply wasn't there. Snow drifted like slow-falling ash, settling on her shoulders as her breath trembled in front of her, and for a moment she wondered if this would be the night the cold finally broke her. But then a pair of headlights cut through the haze, slowing as if drawn by some unseen pull, and the tall figure who stepped out paused as though he, too, felt the strange gravity between them. His silence carried weight, not indifference, and the moment he draped his heavy coat around her shaking frame felt like a question neither of them knew how to answer. Somewhere between the snow and his steady hands, something shifted, soft, unexpected, and far too powerful to ignore. The cold silence between them lingered as she clutched the coat tighter, its weight both comforting and overwhelming, like a kindness she wasn't sure she deserved. They walked slowly toward his car, the snow crunching beneath their feet in steady rhythm. And though he kept a respectful distance, she felt the strange warmth of his presence settling around her like a second layer. Her breath wavered with each step, not only from the cold, but from the fear of what came next, because accepting help meant allowing herself to be seen, truly seen. After months of shrinking into shadows, he opened the car door gently, saying nothing, yet the quiet felt safer than words. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if trust could bloom in the middle of a winter this harsh, before finally lowering herself into the seat, hoping she wasn't stepping into another storm she couldn't survive. The hum of the heater filled the silence as the car pulled away from the curb, thawing her fingers faster than her thoughts. She kept her gaze fixed on the window, watching the city blur into streaks of white and gold, yet she felt his eyes flick toward her every few seconds, checking without intruding. The soft warmth made her ache. It reminded her of what she'd been missing. Simple safety. Simple stillness. She curled deeper into the coat, letting herself breathe for the first time in what felt like days. He drove with steady patience, his hands firm on the wheel, the quiet stretching between them like an unspoken understanding. She couldn't name the feeling settling in her chest, but it wasn't fear. It was something gentler, something she didn't trust yet, but didn't want to push away. When they arrived at his building, she froze, her breath catching as she stared up at the tall structure rising like a dark monument against the snowy sky. It looked too polished, too quiet, too far from anything she had a right to step into. He paused beside her, sensing her hesitation even though she tried to hide it. And for a moment the world felt suspended between fear and possibility. She swallowed hard, clutching the coat closer, the scent of winter and faint cologne grounding her more than she expected. He didn't rush her, he simply waited, letting her choose whether to follow him. After a few still seconds, she nodded softly, realizing that sometimes survival required letting someone hold the door open, even when trust felt like a fragile thread she wasn't sure she could carry. The lobby welcomed them with soft warmth and quiet echoes, a stark contrast to the biting winter outside. She stepped in slowly, feeling the heat wrap around her like something she hadn't been allowed to feel in months, and her eyes drifted across the polished floors and golden lights that seemed almost unreal. He walked slightly ahead, yet kept turning back, ensuring she hadn't fallen behind. The space felt too clean for someone who had spent nights curled on sidewalks, and embarrassment crept up her spine like a chill. Still, he remained patient, guiding her to the elevator with a soft steadiness that eased the tension in her chest. As the doors slid closed, sealing them into a small pocket of warm air and silence, she wondered what this moment would mean in the morning, and whether kindness like his ever came without a cost. The elevator rose in steady silence, carrying them toward a place she wasn't sure she belonged, and she focused on the soft hum beneath her feet to steady her racing breath. When the doors opened, the hallway stretched before her, quiet, warm, and impossibly clean, so different from the concrete nights she'd grown used to. He led her toward a guest room, moving with a gentleness that surprised her, as if he understood she might break if the world grew too loud. Inside, the room glowed with soft lamplight, and she paused at the doorway, feeling the weight of stepping into a space that wasn't meant for someone who had been fighting to survive the streets just hours earlier. He told her she could rest, his voice low, almost hesitant, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to exhale without fear chasing the air from her lungs. Once alone, she sank onto the edge of the neatly made bed, her hands gripping the coat he'd given her as though it were a lifeline. The stillness felt unreal, almost too soft, and she listened for familiar sounds, sirens, cars, footsteps, but heard only the hush of a safe room she didn't know how to relax in. She let her fingers trace the stitching of the coat, feeling warmth that didn't belong to her, a warmth she had no idea how to accept without guilt pressing into her ribs. The ache of survival clung to her, heavy and unyielding, but beneath it fluttered something gentler, something she wasn't ready to name. Outside the door, his soft footsteps moved down the hall, and for a moment she imagined him standing there, wondering if she felt out of place. She whispered a shaky breath into the quiet, letting herself lie back for the first time in far too long. She woke an hour later to the scent of something warm drifting through the air, and her body reacted before her mind did, her stomach tightening with a hunger she'd tried to forget. When she stepped out of the room, she found him in the kitchen, sleeves pushed up, creating a simple meal with a concentration that felt strangely intimate. He didn't look up immediately, as if giving her the choice to enter without pressure. She hovered in the doorway, unsure of how close she was allowed to stand in a place that felt too perfect for her. When he finally glanced over, there was no pity in his eyes, only a quiet check-in, a silent question of whether she felt safe enough to join him. Something inside her loosened at that, and she stepped closer, letting the warmth of the room settle into her bones. They ate in careful silence at first, the clink of utensils echoing lightly through the room. But as the heat from the food settled into her chest, she felt a little of the tightness inside her unravel. He asked simple questions, never probing, never demanding, and she answered only what she felt comfortable sharing, offering pieces of herself in hesitant fragments. His presence felt steady, not heavy, and every now and then she caught him glancing at her, as though trying to understand her without forcing her to speak. The softness of that attention tugged something deep within her, something she had buried beneath months of cold nights and guarded instincts. She wasn't sure what to call the feeling, but she knew it was the first time she didn't feel the need to protect herself from the person sitting across from her. When dinner ended, he offered her a gentle good night and retreated to his room, leaving her in the quiet glow of the living room. She stood there for a moment, staring at the leftover warmth of the space, feeling an unfamiliar calm settle across her shoulders. For the first time in months, she didn't feel hunted by the cold or pulled apart by fear. The apartment felt safe in a way that made her chest ache, like a reminder of everything she'd once had but lost along the way. As she walked back toward the guest room, she paused near the window, watching snowflakes drift softly past the glass. The city lights shimmered against the falling white, and she let herself imagine, just for a heartbeat, that maybe her life wasn't over, that maybe warmth like this didn't have to be temporary. She whispered a grateful breath before closing the door behind her. Morning light crept softly across the guest room, stirring her awake with a warmth she hadn't felt in far too long. For a moment she lay still, letting herself absorb the quiet, afraid the peace would vanish if she moved too quickly. When she finally stepped into the hallway, she caught him in the living room, settled into a quiet stretch of work, yet he looked up the second he sensed her presence, offering a hesitant smile that felt strangely grounding. The tension of unfamiliarity had softened between them, replaced by a slow, fragile recognition neither dared name. She hovered near the doorway, unsure if she should speak, but he broke the silence first, asking whether she slept well in a tone that held more care than convenience. Something small fluttered inside her chest, the kind of comfort that felt dangerous. and she wondered how long it would take before she stopped flinching at simple kindness. Yet somehow, she stepped further into the room, trusting the quiet moment enough to let her guard lower just a little more. Later that morning, she lingered in the kitchen while he prepared coffee, the soft clatter of mugs blending with a faint hum of music from a speaker on the counter. She watched him move with calm precision, almost surprised by how natural it felt to be near him without bracing for impact. He asked if she wanted something warm, and though she meant to decline, her voice betrayed her with a quiet yes. When he handed her the mug, their fingers brushed for a moment. Small, accidental, but enough to spark a warmth she hadn't expected. She backed away slightly, steadying her breath, trying not to read too much into the simple exchange. Yet he said nothing to break the moment, only watched her with a softness that didn't demand anything from her. For the first time, the silence between them didn't feel fragile. It felt safe, almost tender, as though this tiny kitchen had become a place she was finally allowed to exhale. As the afternoon settled in, he suggested they take a walk to clear the heaviness of the day, and she hesitated only a moment before agreeing. The air outside was cold, but kinder than the night he'd found her, and with every step she felt a strange mixture of unease and trust wrestle quietly inside her chest. They walked side by side, not touching, but close enough that the warmth of his presence felt like an unspoken promise. He pointed out small things along the way. The cafe he liked, the bookstore he used to visit with his brother. Tiny pieces of his life he didn't offer lightly. She listened, grateful for every story, feeling honored that he trusted her with them. And though she didn't say much, her silence wasn't guarded anymore. It was steady, open. For the first time, she wondered whether healing didn't always begin with answers. Sometimes it began simply with someone willing to walk beside you, without asking for anything in return. That evening, he found her standing near the window, staring out at the soft glow of the city below. She didn't hear him approach, and when he spoke her name, she flinched lightly before offering a small, apologetic smile. He asked if she was all right, and though she wanted to say yes, the truth slipped through her defenses. She admitted she wasn't used to quiet places or warm ones or days without fear pressing against her ribs. He didn't try to fix her words or drown them in sympathy. Instead, he simply stood beside her, letting the silence do what comfort sometimes couldn't. Their reflections hovered faintly on the glass, two shapes learning how to exist beside each other without retreat. She felt something loosen, a small knot she'd carried alone for too long, and the release brought a sting of tears she blinked away before they could fall. Later that night, she found herself sitting on the edge of the couch while he worked nearby, both of them wrapped in a comfortable quiet. She hesitated, then told him about her art, how she once painted every day, how color had once been her safe place before life pulled her into darker corners. He listened without interruption, the kind of listening that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't expected. When she admitted she hadn't touched a brush in months, he didn't respond with pity, only a gentle encouragement that drifted through the room like a soft breath. She felt something awaken inside her, a thread of hope she thought she'd lost. As the house settled into nighttime calm, she realized she wasn't afraid of tomorrow. Not as long as moments like this existed, where someone finally cared enough to hear her story without judgment. The next morning carried an unexpected heaviness, the kind that settled low and slow, warning of a shift neither of them could name yet. She sensed it the moment he stepped out of his room, his eyes distant, his shoulders stiffened as if bracing for something only he could see. He spoke less, moving through the apartment with a quiet that felt colder than the winter outside. She tried not to take it personally, reminding herself that people had storms inside them long before she entered their lives. Still, every clipped nod, every unfinished sentence chipped at the fragile safety she'd begun to build. By afternoon, the space between them had grown thick with unspoken tension, and she found herself retreating, afraid she had overstayed her welcome. She wondered if kindness always had an expiration date, if warmth eventually faded back into the cold from which it came. As the day stretched on, The weight of his silence grew harder to ignore. She tried to distract herself, folding the blanket she'd used the night before, straightening the guest room, anything to keep her hands busy while her mind spiraled. Meanwhile, he paced in his office, shutting the door halfway, as if unsure whether to keep her out or let her in. A muffled phone call drifted down the hall, a raised voice she had never heard from him, followed by the sharp snap of him ending the call. When he finally emerged, frustration shadowed his features, but the moment he saw her, something like guilt flickered across his expression. She offered a small smile meant to ease the tension, but he only nodded and looked away. In that instant, doubt wrapped itself around her, whispering that she was a burden he hadn't planned for. By evening, the unspoken strain between them had grown too thick to ignore. When she approached him in the living room, he barely looked up. His voice clipped as he muttered that he just needs space. The words landed like ice in her chest, cracking the fragile warmth she'd begun to trust. She stepped back, her breath trembling as she tried to steady herself, telling him she understood even though her heart felt unsteady. He rubbed his face with both hands, looking as though he wanted to say more, but couldn't find the words. The silence that followed was louder than any argument. Sharp, cold, final. She felt the old instinct to disappear, rising in her, pulling her back toward the shadows she had finally begun to leave behind. For the first time since arriving, she wondered if she had made a mistake trusting a kindness that was never meant to last. Hours later, when the apartment had gone still, she found herself packing what little she had, mostly the clothes she'd arrived with and the coat he'd given her. She moved quietly, not wanting to disturb him, though part of her suspected he wouldn't try to stop her even if he heard. Her chest tightened as she folded the coat, unsure whether she had the right to keep something that held so much of his warmth. But the ache of leaving without it felt heavier than the guilt of taking it with her. With every step toward the door, fear curled inside her, familiar and unwelcome, reminding her of the countless nights she had survived alone. She told herself she'd manage again. She always had. But deep down, she hated how fragile the lie sounded. Still, she reached for the doorknob, her heart pounding as though it already knew the cold waiting on the other side. When she finally stepped into the hallway, the weight of the coat over her arm felt heavier than anything she had carried in months. She took one last glance at the apartment, its warm lights, its soft colors, the echo of gentle moments she'd almost allowed herself to believe in. A part of her wished he'd come after her, say something, anything to stop her from walking away, but the silence held steady, a quiet confirmation that whatever bridge they'd begun building had cracked under the strain of unspoken fears. As she stepped into the elevator, her reflection stared back at her, fragile but determined. The doors slid shut slowly, sealing her choice, and she felt her heart break, not because she was leaving, but because she had let herself hope she wouldn't have to. The cold met her immediately when she stepped back onto the street, stinging her cheeks as if the night wanted to remind her of the world she had escaped only briefly. She wrapped the coat tighter around herself, feeling its warmth clash painfully with the emptiness settling inside her. She walked without aim, trying to outrun the ache in her chest, but every step only made the truth clearer. She had left a place where she had begun to feel safe, even if she never meant to stay. By the time she reached the dim little bookstore, she sometimes slept behind. Exhaustion dragged her downward, leaving her trembling as she sank onto the curb. Yet instead of fear, she felt a hollow sadness, like she'd stepped away from something she didn't know she needed. She whispered to the night that she would be fine, even though her voice cracked on the word. Meanwhile, Donovan stood frozen in the hallway long after the elevator doors closed, a silence ringing in his ears louder than any argument could have been. He replayed every moment from the day, every sharp breath he took, every word he failed to say, each one revealing itself as the thread that led her out of his home. He sank onto the couch, running a hand across his face as guilt tightened around him like a vice. He had wanted space, yes, but he hadn't wanted distance. And now, faced with the empty stillness of the apartment, he realized how much warmth she had quietly brought into his world. He rose abruptly, driven by the sudden fear that he had let her walk back into the cold alone. The thought felt unbearable, slicing through the armor he had worn for years. He grabbed his coat and rushed outside, the winter air slapping against his face as he stepped onto the street. Panic pulsed through him with every breath, quick and sharp, fueled by the fear that he might be too late to undo what he had broken. He drove through the city slowly at first, scanning every sidewalk, every corner, every shape huddled in the shadows. When he reached the old bookstore he had once mentioned to her, something pulled him to stop. He stepped out of the car, breath fogging the air as he searched the sidewalk with desperate eyes. And there she was, small, shivering, curled beneath the weight of the coat he had given her. The sight cracked something deep inside him, and he moved toward her without thinking, each step heavy with the apology he had never learned how to speak. When she looked up and saw him walking toward her, she almost didn't believe it. The ache in her chest twisted at the sight of him, his breath quick, his expression raw in a way she had never seen before. He knelt in front of her, asking softly why she left, but she could barely hold his gaze. Her voice wavered as she told him she didn't want to be a burden, that she thought he needed distance from everything, including her. His face tightened as if the words stung, and he shook his head, insisting she had never been a burden, only someone he wasn't brave enough to let in. The honesty in his voice, the tremble hidden beneath his calm tone, pushed tears into her eyes. She didn't know if she could trust it yet, but she felt the truth in the way he reached for her, gentle and steady, as if he feared she might disappear again. He helped her stand, wrapping the coat around her more securely, as though anchoring her to the moment. She leaned into him without thinking, her body remembering the safety she had felt before everything cracked apart. He held her carefully, not tight enough to trap her, but firm enough to let her know she wasn't alone. Not now. Not anymore. Together they stood beneath the falling snow, breathing through the quiet that wrapped around them like a fragile new beginning. He whispered that he wanted her to come back. Not out of obligation, but because he cared, because he wasn't ready to lose whatever fragile thing had begun growing between them. She let his words sink into the cold night, warming places inside her she thought had gone numb forever. When she finally nodded, his shoulders relaxed, and for the first time in days, the air around them felt soft again. Back inside the apartment, the warmth felt different, gentler, fuller, almost like the space itself recognized the shift between them. She moved slowly, taking in the familiar rooms that now held a new softness, a new sense of belonging. He hovered nearby, not crowding her, but close enough that she felt the sincerity in each quiet glance he sent her way. For once, silence wasn't heavy. It felt like healing settling between them. She placed the coat neatly over the back of the couch, smoothing its fabric with care, and he watched her as though memorizing the moment. When he asked if she was hungry, she laughed softly, surprised by the lightness in her own voice. The tension that once lived in her chest had loosened, replaced by something steadier, hope, fragile yet present. She followed him to the kitchen, knowing that this time she wasn't entering as a visitor, but as someone who mattered. The kitchen smelled of warm spices and fresh herbs as he cooked, his movements calmer now, grounded in a quiet relief that she was still there. She leaned against the counter, studying him with renewed curiosity, seeing past the practiced composure to the vulnerability he tried to hide. When he glanced over at her, their eyes met with a gentleness that made her chest flutter. He admitted softly that he wasn't used to trusting people, that losing someone he loved had taught him to close himself off. She listened, offering only her presence in return, letting him speak at his own pace. It struck her how much courage it took for him to open that door, even a little. She stepped closer, thanking him for letting her back in, her voice quiet but steady. In that moment, she felt their wounds meet in a way that didn't hurt. They simply understood each other. After dinner, he brought out a blank canvas and a small box of paints he had found in a closet, placing them gently on the coffee table like an unspoken invitation. She stared at them, unsure if she was ready to face the part of herself she had abandoned long before the winter swallowed her. He didn't pressure her. Instead, he sat at her side, telling her he remembered the way her voice changed when she spoke about art. The memory alone stirred something fragile and bright inside her. She picked up a brush, feeling its familiar weight settle into her palm. Her hand trembled as she dipped it into the paint. But when the first stroke touched the canvas, she exhaled a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. He watched quietly, offering presence instead of praise, letting her reclaim the part of herself she thought she'd lost forever. As hours passed, she painted in soft, careful movements, letting her emotions guide each stroke. Colors blended into one another, warm golds fading into cool blues, soft reds stretching into gentle shadows. He remained nearby, occasionally offering tea or adjusting the lighting when she squinted. There was no rush, no pressure, only a quiet companionship that made her feel safe enough to explore the corners of herself she had long ignored. At some point, she noticed he was watching her, not with curiosity but admiration, a kind she wasn't used to receiving. When she asked why, he simply said she looked alive. The word struck her deeply, settling into a place she hadn't touched in years. She smiled shyly, realizing that for the first time she wasn't just surviving, she was returning to herself. When she finally stepped back from the canvas, her breath caught at what she had created, a blend of colors that felt like a quiet sunrise after a long, brutal night. He moved closer, asking if he could see it, and she nodded, nervous but proud. He studied the painting gently, as if afraid to disturb the emotion woven into each stroke. Then he turned to her, telling her it was beautiful, not with dramatic admiration, but with a sincerity that wrapped itself around her heart. She looked away, overwhelmed by the warmth rising inside her. He reached out, touching her hand lightly, a simple gesture full of meaning. That moment felt like a turning point, an unspoken promise that neither of them had to face their healing alone. As the night deepened, she realized she wasn't just rebuilding her life. She was building something with him. The next morning arrived softly, the kind of morning that felt like a quiet blessing. She woke with the faint memory of painting still warm in her chest and followed the gentle smell of coffee into the living room. He sat near the window, bathed in golden light. A peace settled on him she hadn't seen before. When he looked up at her, the moment stretched, warm, unhurried, filled with a tenderness that didn't need words to exist. She joined him by the window, sipping the warm mug he handed her, feeling the world slow down around them. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Their silence had grown into something safe, something soft. Watching the snow melt along the rooftops below, she felt a sense of possibility bloom inside her. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was beginning again. And he was becoming part of that beginning in a way that felt natural, steady, and real. Later, he told her he had something to show her. She followed him with a flutter of uncertainty as they stepped out into the cold afternoon, walking through streets faintly dusted with melting snow. He didn't speak much during the walk, but his silence felt thoughtful, purposeful. When they finally reached the old community center at the corner, she paused in confusion, until he unlocked the door and guided her inside. The room was bare but not empty. Wooden floors newly polished, blank walls ready for color, and wide windows calling for light. He said he wanted to restore the building, turn it into a space for art and healing, a place for people like her who carried stories the world forgot to listen to. Her breath caught, the weight of his gesture settling over her like something too big to hold. She had never imagined someone would build a space around her voice. She walked deeper into the room, touching the cool walls like she was meeting an old dream she had forgotten she once held. He watched her carefully, uncertain but hopeful, his hands tucked into his pockets as though holding back all the nerves he didn't want her to see. She turned to him slowly, emotion catching in her throat as she thanked him, truly thanked him. Not just for the space, but for believing she deserved something more than survival. He stepped closer, admitting that creating this place wasn't charity. It was his way of healing too, of honoring the parts of himself he had shut away for far too long. The air between them shifted again, lighter and deeper at the same time, filled with the understanding that love sometimes arrived in the form of a second chance neither knew they needed. When they returned to the apartment, the world felt different, wider, warmer, full of paths she never imagined she'd be brave enough to walk. She sat on the couch, letting the reality settle into her bones while he prepared tea in the kitchen with a peaceful ease she hadn't seen in him before. When he joined her, he didn't sit beside her. He sat close, close enough that their shoulders brushed softly. He told her he was scared sometimes, scared of losing people, scared of letting himself care too deeply, but that she had shown him what it meant to live again, instead of simply enduring life. She took his hand, feeling how steady his fingers felt wrapped around hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. Their hearts had already filled the silence with more truth than words could hold. That night, as the sky deepened into a quiet winter dusk, she stood by the window again, watching the city breathe beneath soft clouds. He joined her silently, the warmth of his presence easing against her side. She told him softly that she had started a new painting, one she planned to call Shelter. He smiled, asking what inspired it, and she answered simply, him, not just his kindness, but the way he had opened a door she didn't even know existed inside her, a door leading back to herself. He reached for her hand, intertwining their fingers with a tenderness that felt like a promise. She leaned against him, the world outside fading into soft blur. For the first time in months, she felt whole, safe, wanted, not because he saved her, but because he saw her. And as the dusk settled around them, she whispered a question meant more for herself than him. Have you ever loved someone who made you see yourself differently?